Well, thank you. I haven't done anything yet. Good morning, everyone. So you must be either the more sensible of our attendees or the more resilient. So well done for turning up for an early Friday morning session. Behind these sessions that you've all been enjoying this week, there is a program committee who work very hard and diligently for quite a long time to make sure that we get the best possible presentations we can. And I'm just going to thank Liz Allen from F1000 and Adrian Stanley from Digital Science for being actually excellent program committee members and colleagues, and so it's been great fun working with them, and of course the organisational team at ALPS in the office. So it's been absolutely great. So some of the more astute of you may have noticed there's been some themes running through this conference, and this is the culmination of one of those themes, which is the role of data in research. And I'm very delighted that we have so many distinguished organisations and speakers here today in this plenary. As you see, we've got research funders represented, we've got one of probably the most prestigious and famous journals represented, and we have a distinguished academic and researcher to talk about data. So I'm going to kick off by passing over to not Ashley. This is roughly the order. We've got Carly first, followed by Ashley, Pam, and then Marcus. So I will now hand over to Carly, and Carly, thank you.
Okay, so I'm Carly Strasser from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and it's really exciting to be here. I've really enjoyed a lot of the presentations and talks that I've seen already, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. If you're not aware of the Moore Foundation, we were established by Gordon Moore and his wife Betty, and Gordon is still the chairman of our board. He's the co-founder of Intel, who of course came up with Moore's Law, which has a lot of conversations around it these days, given the data-driven kind of nature of the way that we think about society and science. And within the Moore Foundation, which we're based out of California, we have various areas in which we focus and fund, including patient care, science, the environment, and then the Bay Area, which is kind of a local program. I work in the science program, and we have lots of initiatives within that program, but I'm here representing the Data-Driven Discovery Initiative, which is an initiative that was brought about 4 years ago by a colleague of mine, Chris Menzel. So the idea of this is really that as the internet has come about, there's been a lot more data. I think everybody could agree that the production of data is happening, and there's a lot of conversations around it, particularly in academia, what to do with it, how to talk about it, which department these things belong in. And these conversations are resulting in a lot of questions about how we should best proceed in academia around data. And so all of this data is more and bigger. You hear about the big data, 3 V's, velocity, variety, and the third one. I see. Volume. Thank you. Thank you. That's helpful. So, the idea is that these instruments that we have out there are collecting large amounts of data, and often that data is coming in at a breakneck speed. And how do we process all of this? How do we actually deal with the many data sets that are coming about and make use of them? And it means that we need to have more computation, more stats, more programming, using things like the programming languages and the programs that you see up here, and really thinking about how we can effectively harness all of the value of the data. So the need for data science is ubiquitous. You can go on almost any academic campus these days, and people are talking about it somewhere. However, data science in general is tough to describe it's tough to define depending on the crowd that you're in. And so there's still a lot of debate as to what exactly people mean when they talk about data science. For the purposes of this talk, I'm talking about this convergence of domain expertise, math and stats skills, and computational skills as the real nexus of where data science happens, particularly in academia. And so this sweet spot in the middle is really where all the cool stuff is starting to happen. However, academia in general makes it harder for researchers to engage than it probably should be. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Things like career tracks that aren't really set up for people who have expertise in multiple areas. credit incentives, which we'll talk about, training, and then basically just the general barriers to interdisciplinary work that tend to plague academia. It's not quite sure how to deal with researchers who span multiple departments. So in terms of the credit incentives, this is a really big one with relation to data. So software and data are a big part of computationally intensive research, and it takes a lot of time and expertise to deal with data and to deal with creating software, and we're not really sure how to give credit to those researchers. And the credit is really formed around the journal article and not so much around all of the other things that come out of data-driven science. So this is where our program came in. The Data-Driven Discovery at the Moore Foundation is a $60 million initiative, which expands for 6 years. So we're wrapping up the 4th year. We've promised all 60 million, so I don't have any money to give away. But the 60 million was allotted in these 3 main categories: practices, people, and institutions. And I'll go through each of these very briefly. So first, the institutions, which is really about how do we change the way that institutions think about data-driven research and data-driven researchers. How do we really foster the people that are doing this work in an institutional setting that isn't always amenable to the work that they do. So we fund 3 universities, NYU, UC Berkeley, and University of Washington. And we're doing this in partnership with the Sloan Foundation, and have given each of them $10 million to try and figure out what data science should look like on their campus. They've broken their work up into a series of 6 themes. And I won't talk about all these themes, but I did bold 2 of them, careers and open science, because those are the 2 that are most relevant to things like how do we make data count, how do we make software count, how do we really support career tracks for people that don't always publish 5 or 10 papers a year. Maybe they're publishing a couple of papers, but also creating really important software. The people strategy, I'm going to totally skip over, but the short version is 14 people got 1.5 million each, and that's really about elevating them within their institutions and within their communities, and giving them the freedom to work on things that might not fit neatly into disciplinary boxes. And then the practices institution is the 3rd, and this is the smallest pot of money, but it's definitely one of the more interesting pots of money. So we have a few grantees in this pot that you might have heard of. So Data Carpentry, which is a training system for getting researchers up to speed on computational techniques for their field. The Julia programming language, which is new. The R programming language. Some various Python packages like NumPy, and Binder, which I'll talk about in just a second, as well as Jupyter. So these 2 are specifically interesting in the context of publishing. The Jupyter notebook, who's heard of Jupyter? Anybody? Oh, good. Okay, a few people. So Jupyter's formerly known as IPython notebooks, and it was created by a researcher named Fernando Perez a few years back. And the goal of this software is really to create a workflow space that can track the evolution of a project, all the way from creating the code, describing how you got to where you are, importing the data, and constantly being able to visualize what you're doing as you work on your project. And so it's an interactive lab notebook, really. And this is a screenshot that shows you basically this top bit that has narrative instructions. So you can really use things like formulas. You can use Markdown to describe your project. You can then have a code cell, and then you can run that code cell using some simple keyboard commands and see the output. You can go back up into the code cell, change something, rerun it, and see the output change. And so this very interactive way of tracking the way that you're doing your research is a really exciting thing for data science in particular. So within the Jupyter context, you work in this space that's in the browser, and it incorporates the code that you've created, the narrative, the description of the project, and then information on any dependencies. So things like, you have to download this particular Python package to make this specific code work. These Jupyter notebooks tend to be put on GitHub. So GitHub has a lot of Jupyter notebooks. They have a whole set that you can go and kind of just look around at through the GitHub repository website. And GitHub is also partnering with Binder. So Binder is a project that's basically taking those GitHub repositories that have the Jupyter notebooks, that have the information about the code, the narrative, and the dependencies, and wrapping them all up. And Binder allows you to view the notebook in the browser, it allows you to interact with the notebook, and all the dependencies of the code are captured. So this is a big deal for projects where often when you open up a Jupyter notebook, just from GitHub alone, if you don't have all of the right dependencies on your computer, it's not going to work. So this is really about improving reproducibility. So if you're interested in the Binder project, it's beta.mybinder.org, and they're already talking to some publishers about how to incorporate some of this into the workflow of the researcher as they submit projects or papers to the journal. And it's a really exciting project that we're hoping to be able to announce funding for in the near future. So the reason I'm here is partly because I'm talking about data and data-driven discovery in the context of the researchers that we fund. But also we're thinking a lot in terms of, as funders, what can we do to really maximize the value of the things that we fund, regardless of what they look like or what forms they take. And so in that context, I think of the funders as part of the scientific infrastructure. It's really important that we keep that in mind when we make decisions and policies that could affect our grantees and their disciplinary communities. And so really keeping in mind that those decisions that we do make can have long impacts on the quality of the science and the research process in general that we're hoping our grantees undertake. So in that context, we have grant agreements that if you've ever gotten a grant, then you know that you have to fill out these horrible pieces of paperwork. And within the context of the grant agreement, we have things that we require. So things like meetings, budgets, reporting on progress, and then we have annual reports that we have them fill out. And these annual reports are, what have you done? In some contexts, it's what have you done so that we can tell other people about what you've done. It's not what have you done to make sure that you're behaving. That's not our goal. Our goal is to really figure out how to be partners with our grantees and make sure that they know how best to make their work as publicly available as possible. So these annual reports specifically are something that we can really use to gather information from our grantees and better understand their needs and their work. And one of the things we have in that requirement is we want information on the research outputs from the last 12 months. And notice it's research outputs, so this is something that the NSF and the NIH in the US have also been thinking about, how to expand the definition of what we're looking for evidence of work. And so for the annual reports from the grantees within the DDD program, we basically have this spreadsheet that we have them fill out, and it has their ORCID. We have them give us an output DOI or URL and a title, and then we have a list of things that they can select from. And this is really intended to encourage them to list things like preprints, data sets, and software, and any other things they think of that might be something that we would be interested in knowing about. So we think that this goes a long way towards encouraging them to think about all of the outputs of their research and how those are contributing to the story of the work that they do. So also in the context of this, of course, funders are often interested in open access policies. So the Moore Foundation is not particularly as advanced as, say, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in this respect. So I'm excited to hear about them from Ashley. But in our context, we have a policy in the past that has basically said, we want you to share things and make them available at no cost or at reasonable cost when justified. So if you know anything about policies, you know that this has no teeth, and of course nobody's going to worry too much about it because it doesn't have any sorts of requirements or mandating language. So a little over a year ago, I started working with our legal team to figure out how to evolve this policy, and so we rolled out a new policy in April of this year, which basically states that things have to be available within 12 months, and that's really the only requirement. So they can be green OA, they can be gold OA, they can be however anybody wants to make sure that it's open within 12 months. That's the requirement as of now. And while we were developing out this policy, I actually worked on a manuscript with an intern that we had for the summer, and she basically collected as much information as she could on all of the publications from our grantees, which surprisingly, a lot of funders don't have a good system for collecting that information. We didn't have it. We had it in PDF form in annual reports spread out across all of the different groups within the foundation. And so she spent, this woman, Isha Kare, spent a lot of time collating that information, and so we have a preprint up on bioRxiv with the results of that, but then there's also, we just got accepted in PeerJ, so that's hopefully going to be out relatively soon. And I think in the process of going through the peer review for this paper, I realized that there's a lot of misunderstanding about how much private philanthropies actually do in terms of data collection for their grantees. So there was a lot of kind of disbelief that we didn't have a list already available, that we didn't already know what our grantees were doing. But in this case, it's created a conversation at the foundation to think about how we can kind of better collect this information moving forward. And we're hoping that the Gates Foundation figures it out and we can just copy them. So with that, I'll wrap it up, but I'm happy to respond to any emails or questions on Twitter until we have a question and answer session. Are we doing one now or at the end?
Question maybe now, if someone has a burning question, or we can wait to the end.
Any burning questions?
I'm Suzanne Ketley of Canadian Science Publishing, and we recently launched a journal called Facets. It's a multidisciplinary journal, and one of the sections is going to be data science.
Fantastic.
So I'm very excited, and I'd like to contact you later about that. Yeah. But I did wonder whether your funding covers a fee for open access.
So, oh, did you want to say something else before I answer? Okay. Yeah, so we're happy to pay fees. We don't have a separate pot of money that we're drawing from to pay for APCs. We don't have, obviously, individual arrangements with any publishers. So this is all very new for us. We're going to reevaluate this policy in a few months. We envision that maybe the next step would be to create specific funds to allow our grantees to draw out of those instead of out of their budgets. But right now, we encourage them to use their budgets to pay APCs.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Carly.
Yeah.
Good morning. So my name is Ashley Farley. I'm Associate Officer of Knowledge and Research Services at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I am a librarian by training. I've worked in both public and academic libraries for the past decade, and I've been at the foundation for about 2 years, focusing on our open access policy implementation and helping our grantees in publishing open access. So a little bit about the foundation first, in case you don't know. In order to be successful, we have to identify a set of problems, and in order to do that, we ask ourselves 2 key questions. What are the areas of greatest need, and then where can we have the greatest impact? So out of those answers of those questions, we have our foundation focus areas. We have global health, which is discovering and developing affordable vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics for people in the developing world. We have global development, which is delivering health and development solutions that help people lift themselves out of poverty. We have our USB program, which focuses on college readiness in the States. And then we have GPA, which is promoting public health policies and building strategic alliances to achieve greater impact. And then we have our communications department, which pretty much serves all of these different groups and builds awareness of the foundation's priorities and promoting engagement around these issues. So this is our main why for open access. Right now, our research outputs aren't easily accessible or managed well. So we created a policy to kind of set the foundation for sharing and management of the research. This is our first step in really thinking about open science in the bigger picture. So open access is a fundamental element of the Gates Foundation's commitment to information sharing and transparency. We believe that by freely sharing high-quality research as soon as it's available, we and our partners can develop more efficient and effective strategies to tackle the problems that we're trying to solve. And we also believe that it's going to level the playing field for researchers and scientists globally, and will hopefully increase that global collaboration. So as we know, open access can mean many different things to many different institutions, so I wanted to cover what open access means to us. So this is essentially our policy. First off, it's got to be open access. By any kind of definition, it needs to be openly available to those who wish to access it. And we do require a CC BY license. We believe that this is fundamental to building towards open science, so it promotes reuse. And we need it to be immediately available. We don't want it to be embargoed. And then the underlying data also must be open. Right now we have kind of general guidelines that the grantees can use to provide and make sure that their data is openly available. And we are, as I'll talk, focusing more on this as we move forward. And then our commitment from the foundation is that we are able to cover these fees for our grantees. They come out of a central fund. They don't come out of the individual grant budgets, and we have no limit on when you can utilize these funds or how many articles per grant. So who's the policy apply to? Policy applies to all grant agreements that have been signed after January 1st, 2015. It actually has this publication in peer-reviewed journals clause in it, so that's how we kind of hook our compliancy. So any research that was funded in part or in whole, they must comply with this policy, so are the main grantee and also sub-grantees. Any grantee can opt in at any time. We are more than happy to help cover the fees to make the research openly available. And our goal is to eventually reach 100% compliancy. So our policy has been considered kind of bold in this space, and the reason that is because we don't allow for any exceptions. And this has been really beneficial, and we try to think of very positively because it's allowed us to work with publishers and to reach compliancy agreements that I don't think we would be able to otherwise. We had a 2-year transition period as we communicated out the policy and worked with publishers that weren't already compliant. And so it shows that to both grantees and publishers in the community that we're quite serious about our open access goals. And already when we did a landscape analysis before announcing the policy, about 92% of the current publications were already compliant with our policy, so it wasn't a huge shift. So policy is only as good as the mechanisms that bring it to life. And we didn't want to have the compliancy conversation at the end of publication or at the point of acceptance with our grantees. We really wanted to front load that. So we're able to have the conversations before manuscripts are even submitted. And we also wanted to easily track our research outputs without adding an administrative burden to anyone. And so we created Kronos, which combines the publishing and payment process for our grantees. Currently, it's only available to Gates grantees, but we are looking at scaling up. And this is the first time that we've been able to really connect research outputs with the individual grants. And grantees are able to provide access to the sub-grantees, which is information that we don't collect at the foundation, and it's been a great way to see what teams are actually doing and working together and how they're collaborating, and people are able to publish under specific grants. So our hope is that Kronos will bring clarity to our researchers so they can focus more on the research and not the process necessarily of publishing it. With Kronos, researchers can search an extensive database of journals and see which are compliant and which aren't. After manuscript submission, Kronos will pass that information on directly to the publisher to begin the peer review process. And at the end, we try to capture the invoice and make the payment on the behalf of the author. And then we partner with Altmetric, and so we also collect that kind of impact data after acceptance. And I'm really excited to announce that we have Gates Open Research, which is coming in the fall. We hope to launch by end of October. And so we partnered with F1000. And so our goal is to give another publishing option to our grantees to allow the research to be disseminated without delay and increase transparency and make it easier to support reproducibility. And it supports a move away from the flawed metrics of journal impact factor, and we hope to inform the new policies around researcher assessment. So what's different about it and what we're excited about is that it's fast, it's inclusive, all of our different research outputs can be submitted to the system, it's fully open so it complies with our policy, everything's published with the CC BY license. The source data and code is published right alongside with the article, so it's really easy to see kind of the whole big picture of research. It's transparent, so it's open peer review. And then it's easy to use, and we cover all the costs for the APCs on the author's behalf. So how does it work? So a manuscript is uploaded, it goes through a quick scientific soundness check. And then it's easy to see on the site that it's awaiting peer review. We invite the referees are invited, and then it goes through an open peer review process, and once it gets its proper check marks, it is then submitted into standard indexing sites. And the open peer review is what I am definitely most excited about. I think this is something that's going to be kind of revolutionary. It's great to be able to see all the information, everything's citable. You can see what the reservations are, you can see the exceptions, you can see why something wasn't approved and wasn't moved forward. And so the minimal requirements for indexing is 2 approved or 1 approved and 2 approved with reservations. And moving forward to talking more about data, this is one of the first times we're able to see how data and software is linked in with the actual article. It's easy to see, it's easy to access. I took in a couple examples of underlying data from other publications. So I pulled 4 random publications that we paid the APCs for, we made open access for our grantees, and tried to actually access the underlying data. And it's kind of very interesting to see how different journals tackle this. And overall, I would say it's not quite, there's a lot of opportunity for better accessibility and reproducibility and access to that actual underlying data. It doesn't live in a PDF format or a Word document. So what has worked for us? So we've had the policy rolled out for about 2 years. We've been using Kronos. Just the fact that we know what research outputs we have right now has been great. It's a big change for us. We're able to support researchers in the publishing processes. We help with paying the invoices, making sure the correct license is selected. We help with author forms. So that's been a great support for our grantees. Paying from a central fund, so those funds aren't coming out of a grant budget, and those grant budgets can be used for the research. And then articles are being deposited directly in PubMed Central. And what needs work? So we have a lot of work ahead of us as far as data management goes. I'd love to move past kind of our data underlying guidelines and to help with something a little bit more prescriptive, because a lot of our grantees would like a little bit more guidance. We don't have a repository. It'd be great to have some storage. We have grantees come to us with like petabytes of data, and do we want that? What can we do with it? How can we help support that? And then discoverability, and I'd love to be able to search for all of our data sets and then not necessarily have to find the article level first to get to the data. And then we are starting to think about what open science is and what open science means to us. I'd like to see more support around pre-registration, registered and open clinical trial data, and then thinking about registered protocols and methods, so there's that reproducibility support. So I wanted to leave you with kind of an inspirational thought. We have a lot of potential with all the data and the research, and now we just need to figure out how to best curate it and use it. And this is a saying that we have displayed prominently in the foundation. It's one of my favorites in thinking about how we all have very diverse backgrounds, but we all have a very common goal related to science and solving problems and saving lives. So I'm excited for that. Thanks.
Well, I don't know if this should be a question for you, or maybe we should talk at the end. I wanted to talk about open peer review. So my experience with open peer review, I've only done it once. I was the reviewer. And there was somebody who was really a nice supporter of the community but had never really done science before and made embarrassing gaffes. And I understand that you said that there's a scientific process, but basically me, the editor, and everybody else involved said we are never doing this again, because it's not I guess there's just some parts of the process that it makes sense to actually have a discussion. The editor may not know that whoever put the paper out doesn't know the literature. And it just seems like maybe embarrassment is a part of the past or something. But I really hate open peer review.
Well, thank you for that feedback. I mean, it's definitely something that we consider. But I think from my point of view, it's good to see that, and it's scientific research should be more of a community, and you work together with the people to realize that there's glaring problems in the literature review, and shouldn't that be apparent so anybody reading it can kind of know that maybe the rest of it should be also kind of judged at with the same reservations, and having that transparent, we're able to read the literature and draw our own conclusions, and I think opening it up will also be a huge help and solution in predatory publishing, so we can see the quality of peer review and who's invited, but yeah, I mean, and I think too, that, I mean, there's going to be pros and cons, and there's going to be growing pains, but we have to try it and try new things to really improve the process overall, to see what works and what doesn't.
Hi, Ashley. My name is Pablo. I would like to ask you a question around maybe you have an insight on what happens or what has been happening so far after publication. So do you have insights on where downloads are coming from? So usage data, from which countries, citations, how much the data that is being published is actually being reused, media mentions. Do you guys monitor that?
We do. We use alt metrics, and so that's integrated. So they're pulling all that data, and they also have partnered with Dimensions, which I believe there's somebody here with Dimensions and digital science, and so we're using their products to track that. Data, I think, is more of that's where we need work and where we haven't fully focused on and haven't tracked. I mean, if there's a DOI associated with it, that's possible, but if there isn't, then it's harder to track that usage.
So it's a little more practical. There's a long tradition of sharing data in the physical sciences. Well, long enough, right? And there's a somewhat shorter tradition of sharing data in the human genetics field. They kicked and screamed and got there. Clinical medicine is, as usual, very far behind. And they don't have such a tradition, but the tide is starting to roll in on them because funders are starting to require even of sharing human subjects data. And there are a lot of reasons for why clinical medicine doesn't want to share data. One of the main ones, it's one of the main objections, and this is actually quite a fair thing, is that in the arguments around sharing data, there are two constituents in most fields. You have the people who collect the data, so the investigators, and then you have the people who want to use the data and call them the data analysts. And in clinical medicine, there's actually a third constituent, and those are the people who provide the data. That would be you if you were in a clinical trial. And, you know, unlike mice or stars or rocks or atoms, you know, you would have a say in how your data are used. You have to provide consent. So anyway, the little stew pot that contains the clinical trial investigators and the data analysts has been simmering along for a couple of years with the occasional explosion. And the New England Journal of Medicine got involved because our editor-in-chief sat on a committee at the American Institutes of Medicine. It's sort of a think tank that thinks about things and issues white papers, and it's intended for the government, for our Congress. And then the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors also got interested in this, and they've been working their way through these issues as well. And the third reason is that in our pages started to become quite the place to actually debate this rather hotly, I would say. So this all got started one day. The editor-in-chief walks into my office and he says, "I want to have a meeting." And I say, "Okay," because that's what I do. And he says, "I want to bring in trialists, data analysts, and patients, and we're going to talk about this, and we're going to try to make some progress. We're going to try to align our incentives." I say, "Fine." And he walks out of my office, and I start working on this. And 2 days later, he walks back into my office, and he says, "And I want to have a contest." And I think, "Oh, no." And I say, "Okay." And, you know, the meeting and the contest were a way, you know, we're a medical journal. We like data, you know, we like data. And so this was a way for trialists to try to explain their side of the story, which is how much effort it took to gather the data and share and prepare it for sharing and actually share it. And more obviously, it's a way for the data analysts who have been, you know, screaming for years that if only you gave me these data, I could do great things with them. It was a way for them to show what value they could actually bring to the table. So if you're going to analyze data, you need a data set. And forgive the digression into medicine a little bit, but I'd like you all to think about at the end of this, whether the data analysts actually, proved their point. So you need to know a little bit about what they were working with. The SPRINT trial, if you're a cardiologist, every trial has a cute acronym and a cute logo. But this was a trial funded by the United States government, the National Institutes of Health. It was a large multi-center trial run at 102 centers in the United States and Puerto Rico. And what they did was that they randomized 9,361 people who were over 50 years old and who had high blood pressure to either the current standard of care, which is to lower your blood pressure to 140 milligrams of mercury, or there was an intensively treated group where they were lowering your blood pressure to 120 to see whether that would make any difference. So they were successful. That's the first important thing. It took about 2 medications per person to get the regularly treated group down to 135. And it took about 3 medications per person to get the intensively treated group down to 121. So after about 3.5 years of follow-up, the study was stopped early for efficacy. They had found that the intensively treated group had fewer heart attacks, death, heart failure, sudden, various bad things. So, various bad things that I'm trying not to use jargon here, sorry. So, pardon me in advance. So, the study was stopped in September of 2015, and the primary outcomes were published in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 2015. So the SPRINT investigators and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which was one of the main funders of the study, very kindly agreed to make the data set, the actual data underlying the figures and tables in the New England Journal article, they were going to make this available 1 year ahead of when they had to. The NHLBI has a 2-year exclusivity data sharing clause, but this was going to come out a year in advance. And we challenged all comers, anybody could enter this, to obtain the data from the data repository and try to identify a novel scientific or clinical finding that would advance medical science. Prizes were money and a trip to the meeting to actually present your findings. So entering the challenge was a 4-step process. In step 1, you had to apply to your ethics committee or local institutional review board, and they had either grant you rights to use it, because it's human data, it's an extra step, or they had to provide an exemption. And in step 2, you applied to the data repository, and that included providing your ethics approval and you or your institution usually signing a data use agreement. Those 2 points were requirements of the data repository, and near as I can tell are requirements of a lot of data repositories that hold human subjects data. In step 3, you had to qualify for the challenge. We had a qualifying round because we wanted to be sure that submitters, possible contestants actually had the data, because only if you were just going to use the tables and figures themselves, that wasn't going to help, and that you had to show some level of expertise in using the data. So the qualifying round was we provided 2 questions, and you had to take your pick of which question and answer it correctly. And if you didn't answer the question right the first time, we provided hints. We nursed everybody through the qualifying round. And I can tell you that only about half the people got the question right the first time, their choice of question. And then step 4 was you had to come up with an idea, write up your abstract, 750 words, 1 figure, 75-word lay summary, and submit it to the challenge. We had judges. The judges came from all 3 constituencies, so there were clinical trialists, there were data analysts, statisticians, and patients, people who had actually been in the SPRINT trial. And they judged the challenge on 3 main criteria. First one was, were the methods sound? These people actually know what they were doing. Second is, did this actually advance medical science? This is going to help in the treatment of patients. And then the third criteria was, how cool is it? So the judges, everybody rated them up, we added it up, we scored it up, and they came up with 3 winners. So there were 143 entries from 107 institutions in 26 countries. And this is where they all came from. They came from academic institutions, pharmaceutical companies, regulatory agencies entered the challenge. There were all sorts of people. So these are our second place winners. I'll get to the third place winners in a minute. But these are our second place winners. And they turned out to be a group of medical students from Boston University in Massachusetts. We had no idea they were medical students until I called them up to tell them they won, and then the squeals were something to behold. And what they did is what we call a subgroup analysis. They took all of the patients in the trial who started off with, who had chronic kidney disease, and they analyzed them sort of as a separate data set. And what they found is that chronic kidney disease patients had the same outcomes regardless of which group they were in. In other words, they had, regardless of what your blood pressure was, you actually had the same number of cardiovascular events. But there was a difference in the harms. So the intensively treated patients had more adverse events. They had more falls, they had more acute kidney injury, more fainting episodes, things like that. So their conclusion was that you should not be treating chronic kidney disease patients to an intensive level, to 120 milligrams of mercury. So let's think for a minute about whether they met the goal. You know, did they actually come up with something that could be used to change medical practice? And there is no answer to this question, actually. There is not a yes or no answer to this question. There are a whole bunch of investigators who would say to you that, and this New England Journal of Medicine is actually among them, that when you have a subgroup analysis and you hadn't stratified at randomization for this particular subgroup, that it's only hypothesis generating. So in other words, you really need to gather up a whole bunch of chronic kidney disease patients, randomize them to 140 or 120 milligrams of mercury, and see if this holds up. Because this could totally be by chance. The other side of the coin is some results of subgroup analyses can be so strong that people believe it, or they think the randomization was close enough even though they weren't actually stratified. And if people believe it, and they would not be willing, if the community would not willing to actually enroll their patients in such a trial because they think it's unethical because we know this, then we know this, right? So don't have an answer. Our first place winner was a group from the Clalit Research Institute in Tel Aviv, Israel. They, and also our third place winners, created a risk calculator. And then I'm not going to describe the third place because it's more or less the same thing, only these guys actually did it better. So let me explain a little bit about risk calculators. A study like SPRINT is a population level thing, right? So we say that in 10,000 people, in a group of 10,000 people studied over 3.5 years, there will be 5 fewer events per 1,000 than, right? But when you have the patient in front of you, you don't know whether that person is one of the 5 events over per 1,000 people. Like it's different treating an individual level thing. So what this team did was they generated algorithms based on the various patient characteristics, age, sex, weight, smoking status, and they used the SPRINT data as the basis of those algorithms. So they then created this dashboard into which you plug in, the name, age, sex, whatever. This is what they actually did. And what the judges really liked about it was they weighted each harm and each benefit. So they basically said, death is worse than having a stroke. So if your risk of death is higher, we're going to weight that more. And having acute kidney injury or renal failure is worse than having a fainting episode. So you plug the whole thing in, you get your risk calculator. And they give an individual recommendation. So they changed clinical practice. Once again, the answer is maybe. In this case, this one's closer, I would say. But almost every investigator would say to you that this needs to be validated. So they built these algorithms based on a 10,000 patient data set, a specific one. So they need to go out and find some other data sets and see if their algorithms hold up. And that's what they were going to be doing this summer. So I don't know where they are with that. I assume that that's what they're going to do. You validate it in a couple of data sets, and maybe eventually it will come into being. I mean, so the answer is no, but anybody here heard of the Framingham risk score? Yeah, Kent over here, I'm sure has heard of the Framingham risk score. Okay, so the Framingham risk score is something we use in clinical practice today. And it was developed in the 1980s, I believe. And what happened was a group took a set of data, this time from the town of Framingham, Massachusetts. It's a cohort study. And they generated a bunch of algorithms and came up with a risk calculator. And it's been validated a whole bunch of times, and you use it today. It actually, you can go to the web and type in Framingham risk calculator, and then you put in your age and weight and whatever, and it tells you your risk of having a heart attack in the next 10 years. So this may eventually get there. So we were surprised at the number and the variety of entries we got. Our initial goal was 100 entries, and I considered that quite ambitious, but the other co-chair of the challenge, whose name is Isaac Kohani, and he's a bioinformaticist at Harvard, he says, we can get 100. I'm like, okay. But by the time we qualified the 200th person for the challenge, we were all like totally exhausted. And then we know that the 279 requests that the data repository got, that's more requests than they had in the previous 5 years combined. So they were pretty tired too, and they were really great about this. The other thing we did was we surveyed the people who entered the challenge and the people who failed to enter the challenge, who dropped out along the way. A lot of people did. And the two main problems people had actually doing this was getting their ethics committee approval. Because a lot of people dropped out because they either didn't have a local ethics committee or they just couldn't get it. This was also a timed event, so presumably people who wanted to do it in, not as part of a contest would be able to. And the second hardest thing was actually coming up with a good idea. So now we have these data, what do we do with it? Like, that apparently was the second hardest thing to do. And while, we tried this out, and people were interested. Is the juice worth the squeeze? I would say further research is required, which is always sort of what we say. We don't really know yet. But as time goes on, there were a lot of really good ideas, and as time goes on, there may be, hopefully, some better ideas. Thank you.
How did the editorial board of the journal respond to the challenge? Did they think it was worth doing it, and has it changed any policy in using data?
No. Well, the policy of the New England Journal of Medicine follows the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors policy, and I could get into this now or we could get into this later. I figured this was going to come up. So the journal itself does not have a data sharing policy at this time. The editors, they're pretty skeptical. Like, our editor-in-chief thought this was a great idea, and it didn't actually require any work from the editors. So they just sort of sat back and watched it happen, and when we came up at the end and said we want to, they actually looked at the sort of 10 best entries at the end, because we wanted, we had peer reviewers, but we wanted the editors to see if there were any fatal flaws before we named the winners. And there were a couple that had fatal flaws, and we had to withdraw them from consideration after we went back and forth with a couple of the contestants. But they mostly stayed out of it.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a professor of biological psychology within the Medical Research Council Integrative Epidemiology Unit, and my perspective on this is slightly different, I guess. I'm going to try and link two themes that have been part of this meeting: reproducibility and these innovations in open science, data sharing, and the various constituent parts of that, to show how I think they link. So I'll do a whistle-stop tour through some of the background on reproducibility, and then I'll focus at the end on some of the innovations that I think can improve the quality of the work that we do. The focus is very much on biomedical science, but I think many of the general principles apply more widely. So I'm sure many of you know that there's a lot of debate at the moment around reproducibility in biomedical research. The headline figure from multiple subdisciplines, from multiple methodologies, if you like, is that broadly speaking, about 1/3 to 40% of the biomedical research literature is actually robust, replicable, reproducible. We don't actually have a standardized terminology yet, but roughly speaking, about 1/3 of what we publish looks nailed on, and about 2/3 less so. And we see that from the pharmaceutical industry, from psychological science, from cancer biology, from a range of different perspectives. And the reason for that is that there are a spectrum of behaviors that are now so commonplace within the research community that they're not even necessarily thought of as problematic, that all collectively serve to undermine the quality of the work that we produce and the robustness of the work that we produce. And I think, coming from a public health background, it's worth thinking of this as a kind of public health problem. We worry about fraud, but actually fraud is very rare. What is more problematic are the equivalents of things like everyone drinking a little bit too much alcohol. Everyone does it. The individual level harms are quite modest, but because everyone does it, the impact on society as a whole is considerable. Here, we have the kinds of behaviors that scientists engage in, being overly enthusiastic about their data, creating narratives by selectively excluding some results and including other results. And everyone does this. Everyone thinks it's okay. I even, as an editor, had some authors who were offered major revision, and one of the reviewer comments was, "We were surprised you hypothesized X, we thought you would hypothesize Y," asking for more justification, basically. And the reviewers came back, and in their response letter, they said, "Thank you for your comments, we've changed our hypotheses." And you can't do that. That's the point. A hypothesis is something you have before you look at the data, unless it's a hypothesis-generating study. But they thought it was so okay to say that, because everyone does it, that they put it in their response letter. So this is the problem. There is this spectrum of behaviors that most scientists engage in unconsciously that collectively serve to undermine the quality of what we do. And one of the biggest problems is that we have blurred the distinction between hypothesis testing and hypothesis generating. We heard about hypothesis generating efforts previously, and those can be very valuable as long as you're clear that they are hypothesis generating and they represent a starting point, not an end point. But typically, we are encouraged, incentivized to present our results as hypothesis testing. In other words, we had a specific hypothesis and then we tested it. But the reality is that people explore their data. They work their way through what's been described as the garden of forking paths, looking for statistical evidence that will be sufficient for them to be published in a good journal, and then they essentially trace back the path that they took and pretend that was the only one they took. They don't tell you how many times they rolled the dice, if you like, to get at the results that they're reporting. They create a false narrative around their results. And we can see this again in a range of different fields and the impact that it can have. This was a nice paper by some psychologists from a few years ago, which in an experimental study where they collected data and randomized people to listen to When I'm 64 by the Beatles or another kind of music, those who listened to When I'm 64 became younger. They didn't feel younger. They turned back the arrow of time and they became younger. And these were real data that they collected. It'd be great if it was true. It's not true. And what they showed was that you can present a redacted version of what you did, which is shown here in bold, or you can present a warts and all version, which makes it clear that the study had an extraordinary amount of flexibility built into it at the data collection stage, at the analytical stage, at the reporting stage. And if you present the curated version, then you get a very different impression of the robustness of those results than if you present a transparent, open version. And the reality at the moment is that most scientists present a curated version, partly because they're incentivized to do so. We need to tell stories. We're told that all the time. And yet we're not novelists, we're scientists. And we're constrained by the space available to us. You know, our publishing models are still, to a large extent, constrained by a model that's 400 years old. We have page budgets and limits on display items and so on. So all of those things serve to encourage this curated version of what was done rather than this transparent version of what was done. We see this in the brain imaging literature. This review by Josh Karp surveyed over 240 brain imaging studies. If you're not familiar with fMRI brain imaging, you create very high dimensional data sets that need to be pre-processed before you can analyze them. And you need to take a series of steps to do that. And so you have a very large analytical space to work within. The first point on the right, you can't see it very well, is that most studies didn't report enough information to allow other people to reproduce their study robustly. In other words, you couldn't do the same study again just from the information reported in the paper because of word limits and so on. But secondly, there were almost as many unique analytical pipelines as there were studies, suggesting that people were leveraging chance by exploring that very large analytical space and then selecting only the very best result to report. And actually, you just need to take a look at the psychology literature or any other literature within the biomedical sciences to show that something is up. Because in psychology, over 90% of published papers claim to have found what they were looking for in the first place. Which, if you've ever done science, isn't how it works, frankly. My experiments don't work that well. And there are people who study our ability to see the future, precognition, and those scientists shouldn't recruit from the general population. They should recruit academic psychologists, because either we are incredibly good at hypothesizing or something else is up. And I think something else is up. This is a great satire, actually. It's only a couple of pages long if you have a moment. The author that's an anagram of his real name. So we assume that science is self-correcting, but actually is it? That's an empirical question, because the scientific method has replication built into it as a method of self-correction. But if we don't use that method, then science won't self-correct, or at least not as efficiently and as quickly as we might want it to. And if we take empirical evidence, replication doesn't happen often enough. Even in these 83 clinical trials recommending effective interventions, so these are studies right at the end of the research pipeline where they're saying, we think you should treat people with this, not that. Half of them hadn't been subject to any attempt at replication. And of those that had, some did replicate, some suggested that the initial study had overestimated the benefit of that intervention, and some were contradicted. And actually, which category the replication study fell into was patterned to some extent by how large the original study was. Another side issue, if you like, is that many of our studies are just too small to give us robust results. And scientists themselves aren't necessarily the best people to judge what's going on, because we're invested in our own research topics. We're all human, however much we try to be impartial scientists, the Platonic ideal of the spherical scientists, if you like. We're all excited by our own results. How often have you been in a conversation with someone where you've been disagreeing over something and the other person has said, oh, you're right, I've been wrong all these years. I'm so glad you've pointed that out to me. Scientists are just the same. However much we try not to be, we're just the same. We're invested in our own results. And this was a nice example of two groups of people being shown the same data, ambiguous results, essentially. You sort of look at them that way, it looks great. You look at them the other way, it doesn't look so great. One group were primary study authors who'd worked in that area. One group were methodologists who had no skin in the game. The methodologists were much less likely to be convinced by the data than the people who had worked in that area themselves, because they were invested in that area. And there are other biases that again serve to distort the perception that we have of the robustness of a literature. We all know about publication bias, but citation biases, I think, are just as powerful, because even if the data get out there, if people aren't referring to them, they're essentially invisible. So this is, you don't need to worry about the specifics so much, but here you have two literatures. One on the left-hand side of that figure in white, which gave rise to a second literature, an animal and cell culture literature on the right-hand side, shown in blue. And you have year of publication on the y-axis. Of the original studies, about half were critical and half were supportive. The supportive studies were enough to give rise to this new literature in blue. And here you can see all of the citations. All of those studies from the new literature are citing the supportive data. There's only one citation to the critical data, and it's shown in white because it's a negative citation saying, well, there's this study, but it's crap. So if you're a new researcher coming into that animal and cell culture literature in blue, you would believe that your literature was founded on an absolutely robust body of evidence, whereas in fact it was much more equivocal. And those critical data are essentially invisible to you because no one's citing them. So how would you find them? You'd have to do some serious due diligence to find an article published in 1990 that no one is citing. And another example of citation bias, these are 8 clinical trials of the same intervention over the same comparator for the same disease. So they're all looking at the same thing. The first study was positive, the treatment works, and you can see the citations go through the roof. After that, there were a series of other trials. 2 were neutral, no benefit, but no harm either. and 2 were negative. They were stopped early for safety concerns. And then another trial came along that was positive. By then, there was 1 study that was positive, 2 that were neutral, and 2 that were negative. The sixth study happened to be positive, and you can see that the rates of citation essentially ignore the fact that by then the weight of evidence is against the intervention. So people aren't taking into account the bad news, they just focus on the good news. And the reason for that is because of the way that we're incentivized as scientists. We're incentivized to find things, we're incentivized to do groundbreaking research, we're incentivized to publish in journals with a high impact factor, despite the fact that impact factor correlates more strongly with likelihood of retraction than it does with number of citations, which is impressive for something that's calculated from citations. And those pressures create something that's akin to the banking crisis, that we are incentivized to do high-risk, high-return work, because that's what gets us promoted, that's what gets us our next grant. But of course, if all we're doing is high-risk, high-return work, then if we're not careful, the whole system comes crashing down. So this paper describes what I think is at the heart of the problem, which is quality control. And the analogy that was introduced by Roby Blumenstein, who's the CEO of the CHDI Foundation in the US that funds Huntington's research and that convened a meeting to discuss these issues, was that science is a bit like the US automobile industry in the 1970s, where cars would roll off the production line in Detroit at a rapid rate. Some guy would count the number of wheels and check that the engine started. These cars would all drive off, break down later, and have to be fixed again. And it was the era of the lemon, cars that were just badly built and kept breaking down. You give this talk to a young audience, and not that you're an old audience, but this concept has fallen out. People don't know what a lemon is anymore if you're below a certain age, because cars are so reliable now. What happened was that Edwards Deming, a statistician from the US, went to work in Japan, introduced the concept of quality control at every step of the production pipeline. So you'd build a small part, check it was well made, build a larger part, check it was well made. And as a result, the cars that came off the production line were really high quality, and the Japanese automobile industry still has a reputation for reliability today. And the other insight was that by improving the quality of the work that you do, not only do you improve the quality of your product, not surprisingly, but you also improve efficiency and productivity because you're not expending resources on fixing stuff later. Science at the moment creates outputs that are essentially intended to be fixed later. But we aren't even doing that because replication studies aren't given a high priority. People don't do enough of those. So we have lots of low-quality stuff being generated by our research pipelines. So how do we fix that? Well, this is where I think open science comes in. And I think there are a number of different stakeholders. From the bottom up, researchers can change their practices. But critically, from the top down, key stakeholders like institutions, journals, and funders can change their practices. There are some things that we can do, and they all link into this concept of open science. So, for example, we can pre-register our study protocols and our primary outcomes and say, before we look at the data, before we even collect the data, this is the outcome that we think that matters. This is now common in clinical trials, although not universal. And the impact of that is shown here. This is a major funder, in fact, the same funder we were hearing about earlier, in the US, who required pre-registration of primary outcomes in 2000. And that little flag there. Before then, most of the trials that they had funded claimed that they worked. And those are the little crosses. And some said that they were neutral, which are in blue. But of course, you had no way of knowing whether the outcome that they claimed a benefit for was in fact the one that they thought was their primary outcome before they collected their data. After pre-registration was required, you could check that, and you can see the shift. Most of the trials after that point were neutral, a couple were positive, and one for the first time showed evidence of harm. So on the left-hand side, when science is non-transparent, you get a very distorted impression of the strength of evidence. Afterwards, I would say you get a more accurate impression. Also, journals can award badges to incentivize different open science practices. So this is the journal Psychological Science, which is now awarding what amount to Boy Scout badges for individual journal articles. And you can receive a badge after acceptance in the journal for open data on the left, open materials, and then pre-registration of your study protocol. And these are just intended to incentivize those practices because they serve as quality control badges for that article. And the data on the right here show rates of data sharing within the journal in a pre-post design. So before the badges were introduced, which is that red dotted line in the middle, rates of data sharing were very low. After that badge was introduced, rates of data sharing went up. This isn't a randomized design. You've got to be a little bit careful about how you interpret these data, but they're certainly suggestive of an improvement, because when you look at the comparator journals, a range of other journals in the same area that didn't introduce badges, there's no change in data sharing over the same period. So we can incentivize scientists, and it tells you something about scientists that they will change their practices for something as trivial as a badge. We're very insecure people. But these are easy ways to incentivize certain kinds of practices. I don't think we should necessarily assume that these things will be universally good. I think we need to evidence that. But we're in the middle of a very exciting, I think, natural experiment where people are innovating and trying different things. And we recently described a range of different measures that key stakeholders like journals and funders, as well as researchers themselves, but also critically institutions, could implement to improve the quality of what we produce. And so to give you some examples of things that we're doing, from my own perspective as a research group leader, we are increasingly adopting an open science model whereby all of our study protocols are pre-registered all the way down to undergraduate projects. All of our data are made open, and we've had to work with our governance people to change our informed consent procedures to make sure that our participants are consenting to that. Our data sets have been downloaded over 200 times from people in over 200 countries. The key point here is not that we necessarily think people are going to use those data or even look at them. Some people have, and we know that they've been used for teaching purposes, which is great. So this isn't just about science, or at least research. But the reason for doing it is that the fact that our work is open serves as a quality control process. With our study protocols, there have been a number of times when we've had the data in front of us and we thought we must have said that we were going to look at differences between men and women, say. And we go back to our protocol that we registered 2 years before and go through it and, we didn't. Doesn't mean we can't do that analysis, but it's easy to fool yourself into thinking that you must have said that you were going to do that once you see the data. We're easily fooled as humans. And the pre-registered protocol prevents us from fooling ourselves as much as allowing other people to check on whether or not we've done what we said we were going to do. Similarly, open data, because we're very insecure characters, the fact that someone could check your data set and find a typo is enough of an incentive for a researcher to check their data set 4 or 5 times, whereas previously they would have checked it 2 or 3 times. If you look at published articles that have been written by multiple authors, been through multiple rounds of peer review, have been copy-edited, have been proofread, there are still typos in them. Any human endeavor is going to involve honest human error. And the same is going to be true for data sets. So anything that we can do to improve the degree of error checking and the quality control process that is applied to those data, the better. And open data, I think, serves that purpose. So open science, I think, is valuable for lots of reasons, but the key one that I think is worth articulating here is that it serves as a quality control process by shining that light on the whole process. And then that leads to other potential innovations, which is the last thing that I'll talk about briefly. We're now running pilot studies between journals and funders, because at the moment there's a disconnect between what funders do and what journals do. Funders will judge a proposal on the basis of, is this question interesting, and are the methods robust enough that we should do the work, even if it doesn't actually pan out the way that we hope. And that's what science should be about, I think. Journals, because they focus on their impact factor and their citations and so on, think, is it exciting? Is it groundbreaking? And of course, the reason we break ground is to build something. If all you do, as Ottilie Liza at Cambridge says, if all you do is groundbreaking work, then all you end up with is a lot of holes in the ground. So what we are trying to do in these pilots is align those two processes better by creating a single peer review process where you as a researcher go to a funder who has partnered with a journal and you say, this is what we want to do, we think the question's interesting, we think the methods are robust. And that is reviewed by the funder and the journal in a harmonized process. And at the end of that, you get funding to do the work and, in principle, acceptance of the work in that journal, irrespective of the outcome, because the question's interesting. And if the question's interesting, the answer should be useful, irrespective of whether it's exciting or not. And so that creates a single process that, in principle, could reduce the burden on reviewers, that would then make sure that the results that we fund are published rapidly in a journal that will be the right journal for that work to be published in. Thank you.
Hi, brilliant talks. Okay, so here we go. Right, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, quick check for scientific soundness. Marcus, NEJM, it's a bit more complicated than that. Discuss.
I'll come back over here.
Well, is anyone going to respond to that? I think it's, or is it meant to be rhetorical?
I mean, I think that's the intent of the whole open process following that. So it's posted, it's available, you can see the open peer review, anybody can comment on it as long as they're named and affiliated with, that they actually are affiliated with an institution, and so that whole, I think, open process just adds to that scientific soundness after the fact. I mean, I think we kind of view publications right now as a very static document, and this is creating more of a living document, more of a process. It's very iterative. Authors can make changes as many times as they want, and that's all visible, it's all citable, it's version controlled. So that's what I look forward to seeing. And I should have said that we are following in the footsteps of the Wellcome Trust, and so they have Wellcome Open Research, so if you want to actually go see what this looks like right now, you can go to their website, browse through the articles, and see that whole process unfold. There's some really fascinating and really content-rich articles on there.
I mean, I think it is complicated, but I think it's complicated because there are so many different moving parts to, that's why I call it an ecosystem when I talk about scientific research, and there are different stakeholders, all of whom are coming from different perspectives. I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that so many of the ways in which we work are essentially anachronistic. The concept of a journal is 400 years old, the statistical methods that we use, the basic null hypothesis significance testing framework is 100 years old. Many academics still work on the model of there being some senior person with a sort of group of acolytes beneath, typically him, but sometimes her. And that's the kind of the Victorian model of the gentleman scientist, if you like. And the reality of how science works now is very different. But we haven't brought our processes up to date to reflect that. Whether or not we need journals, whether or not journals need to be so distinct from funders, whether or not we could actually have living documents where you register your study protocol, then you post your data, then you post a summary of the results, and then you just put a DOI wrapper around all of that, for example. I think we can be much more innovative. And those innovations are happening. The question will be, which ones work, which ones are acceptable. We might end up with VHS rather than Betamax, but that's okay if everyone uses it. We shouldn't necessarily let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And what are the unintended consequences going to be? We shouldn't just assume that it will all be brilliant because these ideas seem brilliant. Because it's such a complicated ecosystem, a change here could lead to a counter change here so that the net effect is actually negative, and we need to be constantly reviewing the impact of the changes that we introduce. But it does feel like quite an exciting time. People talk about a reproducibility crisis, but I think it's much more of an opportunity.
Phil Hurst, Royal Society, previous publisher of Victorian journals. I have a question on pre-registration. We're trying to encourage pre-registration in science. So my question is, where are the incentives for pre-registration, and is there anything we can learn from medicine?
Well, in medicine, basically what happened was a group of journal editors got together and said, we're not going to publish your paper unless you do this. And it started, there were 13 member journals. The 13 members of the ICMJ is actually not really journals, they're people, but there are 300 plus medical journals that say that they follow those requirements. And so basically the journals got together and said, we're not publishing your paper unless you register your trials, and that was enough incentive for people to do it. And along the way, actually, I'm trying to remember, but I think it came a little later, but the US Congress passed a law that said that if you were doing certain kinds of studies, you also had to register them. But that actually came a little later, but you could try to get the governments to go with it too if you want.
And funders, of course, as well. I mean, we haven't explored this much yet, but I can see moving forward that, we can make these type of requirements that if you want funding, then you must pre-register what you're going to do with it.
Certainly in the UK, there's an increasing movement towards asking people who are applying for grants what measures they will take to ensure the reproducibility of their research, and that can include protocol pre-registration. But it's a good example of how there can be sort of bottom-up and top-down moves to introduce that kind of change. So from the bottom up, researchers themselves might want to pre-register their protocols, because when I get to the end of my career, I'm not going to look back on how many publications I had, but rather what I've found that was actually right and made a difference. That's what's going to matter at the end of my career. But proximally, the problem is that I'm not incentivized to be right. I'm incentivized to publish and get grants and so on. So really, the big change will happen when the stakeholders that have the biggest levers available to them, the funders, the journals, the institutions, start to mandate this stuff.
In relation to the last talk, we all know that the pharmaceutical industry do their own trial, and that the medical agency do not do the experiences again. From your talk, can we conclude that we have to be very skeptical about all the findings and drugs that they come out?
Not necessarily. So the pharmaceutical industry is an interesting kind of microcosm. So the problem in academic science, as I've alluded to, is that we are not incentivized to be right, to get the right answer. We're incentivized to publish and to get grants. And so what is good for scientists is not necessarily what's good for science. Within the pharmaceutical industry, the pressures are different depending on what stage of the drug discovery pipeline you're at. So the problems you're talking about at the clinical trials, marketing end of the pipeline, are the ones that have been described by people like Ben Goldacre, because by then they've invested billions of dollars in that compound and they want to recoup that investment. And so the pressures on them are to make sure that they provide evidence that the drug works, suppress evidence that the drug doesn't work, and so on. And that's no different to the sorts of pressures in principle that other scientists in the academic sector are experiencing. But at the early stage of the drug discovery pipeline, they're actually very conservative, and they're incentivized better, I think, to be right, because they don't want to make a go decision on a compound that turns out not to work, because then their company will invest lots of money in something that ultimately isn't going to recoup that investment. So the incentive structures in the pharmaceutical industry change depending on where you're looking in the drug discovery pipeline, and I think that can tell us something about the kinds of incentive structures that shape the behavior of scientists more widely in academia and beyond. So there are reasons to be skeptical of some of the results of clinical trials funded by the pharma industry, but that's where regulation and mandated efforts by journals serve to act against that.
Right. I think actually your question relates back to the first question, which is that one of the problems, I think, with open data is that it works fine if scientists are talking to scientists. If we assume that I made it all available and you're going to be able to interpret it the same way that I interpret it, but in theory, but interpretations vary, and the closer you get to the possibility of doing harm, the more difficult the whole open data thing is, which is why I think part of the reason clinical medicine is so far behind is that now you're talking about differences in interpretation, and those differences can actually harm people. Sort of the problem. I mean, but I will say for drugs, we have regulatory agencies that actually help interpret that. Besides having journal editors, you hope who will help, you also have regulatory agencies because they actually see all the data and make a final interpretation, and you assume they're a neutral third party.